Tonight, we descend, not into fire and brimstone, not into the torture chambers of medieval imagination, but into something far older, far stranger, and infinitely more complex. We're going to explore the realm of Hades, the god who rules it, and the myths that have shaped our understanding of death itself for thousands of years. This is the complete story of Hades in Greek mythology, from his traumatic birth to his reluctant throne, from his lonely palace to the heroes who dared to challenge his domain. If you enjoy these videos and they help you sleep, you would be helping me tremendously by liking the video and subscribing. Also, let me know in the comments, what do you think of Hades? Is he a hero or a villain? Now let's clear something up. When most people hear the name Hades, they think of a Greek version of Satan, a red-skinned devil with a pitchfork cackling over bubbling cauldrons of tortured souls. That image, it's completely wrong. The ancient Greeks would have been utterly confused by our modern depiction of Hades as some cosmic villain. To them, Hades was not evil. He was necessary. He was the god of the inevitable, the keeper of balance, the one who ensured that death remained permanent and that the natural order of the universe stayed intact. Hades was many things: solemn, stern, feared, misunderstood, but he was never malicious. He didn't torture souls for entertainment. He didn't tempt mortals into sin. He simply ruled over the dead with the same steady hand that his brother Zeus used to command the sky and his brother Poseidon used to govern the seas. Where Zeus was passionate and volatile, Hades was calm and methodical. Where Poseidon raged with the storms, Hades waited with the patience of stone. The Greeks were so afraid of Hades that they rarely spoke his name aloud. To say Hades was to invoke him, to draw his attention, and nobody wanted the god of death noticing them before their time. Instead, they used euphemisms. They called him Pluton, meaning the wealthy one, because precious metals and gems came from beneath the earth, from his domain. They called him Clymenus, the renowned one. They called him Eubulius, good counselor. They called him many things, anything but his true name, as if by avoiding it they could postpone their inevitable meeting with him. But Hades had another name too, one that referred not to the god himself, but to his kingdom. Hades meant both the deity and the place, the ruler and the realm. It was the Greek underworld, the land of the dead, a vast subterranean kingdom of mist and shadow where every mortal soul would eventually journey. And despite what you might think, it wasn't all doom and gloom. Hades, the place, had regions of paradise and fields of endless grey, rivers that inspired terror and meadows where heroes feasted for eternity. It was complicated, nuanced, and utterly fascinating. So dim the lights. Settle in, and let's journey together into the darkness to meet the god who never wanted to rule the dead, but became the most feared and respected deity in all of Greek mythology. Let's explore the complete story of Hades, the birth of a god and a childhood in darkness. To understand Hades, we must begin at the very beginning, before he was the grim lord of the underworld, before he wore a helm of darkness, before his name became synonymous with death itself. We must begin when he was simply a newborn, the eldest son of two titans, born into a world that was already breaking apart. His father was Cronus, lord of the Titans, ruler of the cosmos during the fabled Golden Age. Cronus had overthrown his own father, Uranos, the sky, in a brutal act of violence that set the tone for divine succession in Greek myth. He took a great stone sickle, forged by his mother Gaia, and castrated Uranos, flinging the severed genitals into the sea. From the blood that fell to earth came the Furies, those ancient spirits of vengeance. From the foam where the flesh met the waves rose Aphrodite, goddess of love, a strange beauty, born from an act of unspeakable violence. But Cronos' triumph was poisoned from the start. As Uranos fell, wounded and furious, he uttered a curse, a prophecy that would haunt Cronos for the rest of his reign. He declared that one day Cronos too would be overthrown by his own child, just as he had overthrown his father. The cycle would continue. The son would devour the father. Power would never be secure. Cronos, newly crowned and already paranoid, took that prophecy to heart. He married his sister Rhea, as was common among the Titans, and together they began to have children. Rhea's first child was Hestia, goddess of the hearth. The moment she was born, Cronos snatched her up and swallowed her whole. Rhea wept, but Cronos was unmoved. The prophecy was clear. One of his children would destroy him. Therefore, none of his children could be allowed to grow. Next came Demeter, goddess of the harvest. Down she went, swallowed into the dark. Then Hera, queen of the gods-to-be, who would one day command the heavens. She too disappeared into Cronos' belly. And then, after her, came Hades. Hades was the first male child, the eldest son, the heir by every tradition of inheritance. He should have been celebrated, honored, groomed to rule. Instead, the moment he drew his first breath, he was seized by his father and swallowed. There was no ceremony, no hesitation, no mercy. One moment, Hades existed in the light. The next, he was imprisoned in a darkness beyond darkness, trapped inside his father's body, alongside his sisters. It's difficult to imagine what that must have been like. Ancient sources don't dwell on the experience, but we can infer certain things. The children were gods, immortal even as infants, which meant they could not die. But they also could not grow, could not move, could not escape. They existed in a timeless prison, aware but helpless, surrounded by the churning acids of their father's divine stomach. Days passed, then years, then decades. Hades remained frozen in infancy, conscious but powerless, while the world outside continued without him. After Hades came Poseidon, the sea god, who joined his siblings in their dark prison. And finally came Zeus, the youngest, the last child of Cronus and Rhea. But Rhea had learned. She'd endured 5 children being swallowed, 5 births that ended in immediate loss, and she refused to let it happen again. When Zeus was born, Rhea wrapped a stone in swaddling clothes and presented it to Cronus. She had chosen the stone carefully, making sure it was roughly the size and weight of a newborn god. Cronus, ever efficient in his paranoia, swallowed it without checking, without pausing to wonder why this child made no sound, why it felt oddly rigid in his hands. He assumed it was Zeus, and that was enough. The real Zeus, meanwhile, was spirited away to the island of Crete, hidden in a cave on Mount Ida. There, he was raised in secret by nymphs and fed on the milk of a divine goat named Amalthea. The priests of Zeus, called the Curetes, clashed their spears against their shields whenever the infant cried, drowning out the sound so that Cronus would not hear and discover the deception. Zeus grew up free. He learned, he trained, he plotted, and when he was old enough, strong enough, clever enough, he returned to face his father. With the help of his grandmother Gaia and the wise Titanomachy, Zeus concocted a plan. He disguised himself as a cupbearer and approached Cronus' court. He offered his father a drink, a special mixture of wine and mustard, or in some versions, a powerful emetic potion designed by Metis herself. Cronus drank deeply, suspecting nothing, and then he began to vomit. First came the stone, the one he'd swallowed thinking it was Zeus. It flew from his mouth and landed with a crash. Then came Poseidon, fully grown, disoriented but alive. Then Hades, blinking in the sudden light after decades of darkness. Then Hera, Demeter, and Hestia, one by one, the children of Cronus emerged from their prison, no longer helpless infants, but powerful gods in their prime. Imagine what that must have been like for Hades. One moment, trapped in suffocating darkness, time meaningless, existence reduced to pure consciousness without sensation. The next moment, light, air, space, his body suddenly responding to his will, his eyes seeing the world for the first time in living memory. The cave, or palace, or wherever this happened must have seemed impossibly vast after so long in confinement. The sounds must have been overwhelming. The very concept of movement, of breathing fresh air, of standing on solid ground, all of it new and terrifying and exhilarating all at once. But there was no time for adjustment, no gentle reintroduction to existence. Cronus, realizing what had happened, roared with fury. The Titans rallied to his side, and the 6 children of Cronus and Rhea found themselves immediately embroiled in a war for the survival of the universe itself. This was the Titanomachy, the great war between the old gods and the new, and it would rage for 10 long years. Cronus and his Titan allies took their stand on Mount Othrys, a fortress of stone and cloud. Zeus and his siblings established their base on Mount Olympus, the highest peak in Greece, a symbol of their aspiration to rule from the heavens. For Hades, this war was his introduction to the world. He had no childhood, no carefree youth, no time to learn who he was or what he wanted. From the moment of his liberation, he was a soldier, a warrior in a cosmic conflict that would determine the fate of existence itself. The war was brutal. Mountains shook, the earth cracked open, the sky burned. Titans and gods clashed in battles that reshaped the landscape of Greece. But for all their fury and determination, neither side could gain the upper hand. The Titans were ancient, powerful, experienced, in ways the younger gods were not. The Olympians were passionate, innovative, desperate in their need to win. But passion alone wasn't enough. Zeus realized they needed allies. But where could they turn? Most of the Titans stood with Cronus. Most of the primordial forces were neutral, watching and waiting to see which side would prove stronger. Zeus needed something more, something unexpected. He descended into Tartarus, the deepest pit of the cosmos, a place of absolute darkness far below even the roots of the earth. There, imprisoned by Uranus eons ago, were creatures of immense power, beings so terrifying that even the Titans feared them. The Cyclopes were there, one-eyed giants of incredible skill, master craftsmen who could forge wonders from raw elements. They had been locked away because Uranus found them too ugly, too useful, too potentially dangerous. Zeus freed them, breaking their chains and offering them a place in the new world order. The Hecatonchires were there, too, the 100-handed ones, 3 brothers each with 50 heads and 100 arms. They were chaos incarnate, living weapons of incomprehensible power. Zeus freed them as well. In gratitude, the Cyclopes set to work. They were craftsmen of divine weapons, and they forged 3 gifts that would turn the tide of war. For Zeus, they created the thunderbolt, a weapon of pure sky fire that could split mountains and turn armies to ash. It was not just a bolt of lightning, but concentrated divine power, the wrath of the heavens made manifest. For Poseidon, they forged a trident, a 3-pronged spear that could command the seas, create earthquakes, and summon storms. With it, Poseidon could shake the very foundations of the earth. And for Hades, the eldest, the firstborn, they created something different. They forged the Helm of Darkness, also called the Cap of Invisibility. It was a helmet that, when worn, rendered the wearer completely invisible, not just to mortal eyes, but to divine senses as well. Even gods could not see, hear, or perceive someone wearing the Helm of Darkness. It was a perfect weapon for Hades, not flashy like Zeus's thunderbolt, not aggressive like Poseidon's trident, but subtle, strategic, terrifying in its implications. A god you couldn't see was a god you couldn't fight. A force you couldn't detect was a force you couldn't defend against. With these weapons and their new allies, the Olympians launched a final assault on Mount Othrys. Zeus hurled thunderbolts that shattered stone and burned sky. Poseidon struck the earth with his trident, and the ground itself became a weapon, heaving and cracking beneath the Titans' feet. The Hecatoncheires hurled boulders by the hundreds, a rain of stone that never ceased, never slowed. And Hades, wearing his Helm of Darkness, moved unseen through the battlefield. He stole weapons from Titan hands. He whispered false orders that sent troops into ambush. He appeared behind enemy lines, struck, and vanished before anyone could react. He was fear itself, invisible and inescapable. The Titans broke, some fled, some surrendered. Cronus, stubborn to the end, fought until Zeus struck him down with a thunderbolt that left the sky itself scarred. The war was over. The Olympians had won. But victory brought a new problem. What to do with the world they had conquered, the division of the cosmos. The battlefield was silent now, littered with the broken bodies of Titans and the scorched remnants of divine fury. Smoke rose from Mount Othrys, and somewhere in the distance, the earth itself was still settling, still adjusting to the violence it had endured for a decade. The 6 children of Cronus and Rhea stood together, victorious but exhausted. They had won the war. They had overthrown the Titans. They had proven themselves worthy to rule. But none of them had stopped to consider what came next. How do you divide a cosmos? How do you split reality itself among 6 gods who have only ever known conflict? Hestia, the eldest daughter, wanted no part of rulership. She was the goddess of the hearth, of home and family, and she was content to tend the eternal flame of Olympus, to be honored in every household, but to claim no throne, no realm, no domain beyond the warmth of fire and the sanctity of the home. She would be the first to receive offerings at every sacrifice, but she would never compete for power. Demeter, goddess of the harvest, was similarly uninterested in cosmic politics. Her concern was with the earth, with the growing things, with the seasons and the grain. She would ensure that humanity could eat, that crops would grow, that the world would not starve. That was dominion enough for her. Hera had her eyes on a different prize entirely. She wanted to be queen, to stand beside whichever of her brothers claimed the throne of the cosmos. She was ambitious, proud, and fiercely intelligent. She would not be content with a minor role in this new world order that left 3 brothers: Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades. Zeus, the youngest, the one who had freed them all, the one who had led them to victory, believed he had the strongest claim to supreme power. He had wielded the thunderbolt with devastating effect. He had been the strategist, the leader, the face of their rebellion. Surely the sky, the highest realm, the throne of the cosmos itself, should be his. Poseidon, tempestuous and powerful, wanted the seas. He had always felt a connection to water, to the vast mysteries of the ocean. But he also wanted recognition, wanted respect, wanted to be seen as equal to Zeus rather than subordinate. And Hades, the eldest, the firstborn, had every traditional right to rule. In any normal system of succession, the eldest son inherits. Hades had suffered longer than any of them, trapped in darkness while Zeus grew up in sunlight. He had fought just as hard in the war, had contributed just as much to their victory. By rights, the cosmos should be his. But Hades was not interested in fighting his brothers. Perhaps it was exhaustion. Perhaps it was wisdom. Perhaps after so long in the darkness of Cronus' belly, he simply didn't want to engage in yet another conflict. Whatever the reason, Hades agreed to Zeus's proposal. They would draw lots. 3 realms would be divided: the sky, the sea, and the underworld. The earth itself would be shared among all the gods, neutral territory where any could walk. But each brother would have his own kingdom, his own throne, his own absolute domain. They used 3 straws, or in some versions, 3 stones. 1 long, 1 medium, 1 short. Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades drew. Zeus drew the long straw. He received the sky, the clouds, the storms, the very air itself. He would be king of the gods, ruler of Olympus, lord of the heavens. His would be the highest throne, the greatest power, the final word in divine disputes. Poseidon drew the medium straw. He received the seas, all the waters of the world, from the deepest ocean trenches to the surface waves that sailors feared and revered. He would build his palace of coral and pearl beneath the waves, would command sea monsters and storms, would be feared by anyone who dared to sail. And Hades, the eldest, the firstborn, drew the short straw. He received the underworld, the land of the dead, the realm of shadows, the place where every mortal soul would eventually journey, where the light of the sun never reached, where nothing grew and nothing changed. It was not punishment, not exactly. Someone had to rule the dead. Someone had to maintain the boundary between life and death, to ensure that souls stayed where they belonged, that the natural order remained intact. But it was exile nonetheless. Zeus would rule from Mount Olympus, surrounded by other gods, hosting banquets and celebrations, governing the universe with a thunderbolt in one hand and a cup of nectar in the other. Poseidon would rage through the seas, volatile and powerful, feared and worshipped by sailors, occasionally visiting the surface world to seduce nymphs or punish disrespectful mortals. And Hades would descend into the darkness once more, not the suffocating imprisonment of his father's belly, but a different kind of isolation. He would be alone among the dead, cut off from his family, from the warmth of the sun, from the living world. He would be necessary but not celebrated, feared but not loved, respected but never invited to the parties on Olympus. In some versions of the story, Hades protested. He argued that the lots were unfair, that Zeus had manipulated the draw. But if he did object, it didn't matter. The decision was made. The cosmos was divided, and Hades, true to his nature, accepted his fate with quiet dignity. He gathered his few possessions, donned his helm of darkness, and descended, past the surface of the earth, past the roots of mountains, past the layers of stone and sediment, down into the deep places where sunlight becomes memory and darkness becomes absolute. He descended to his throne. And there, in the realm of the dead, surrounded by mist and shadow, Hades became the god we know today. Not by choice, not through ambition or cruelty or desire for power, but through a simple twist of fate, a short straw drawn by the eldest son, who had already suffered more than any of his siblings. Hades became the lord of the underworld, and he would wear that crown, heavy and cold, for all eternity. Before we can understand Hades as a god, we need to understand Hades as a place. The Greek underworld was not simply a void, not merely an absence of life. It was a fully realized realm with its own geography, its own rules, its own strange and terrible beauty. It was vast beyond imagination, a mirror world beneath the earth where physics worked differently and time flowed like cold honey. The entrance to Hades was not singular. There were many gates scattered across Greece and beyond. Some said the main entrance was at Cape Taenarum in Laconia, where a cave descended so deep that no living man had reached its bottom. Others claimed it lay near Lake Avernus in Italy, where volcanic gases rose from the earth and birds that flew overhead would drop dead from the fumes. There were entrances in Thrace, in the groves near Cumae, in hidden valleys where the veil between worlds grew thin. But regardless of which entrance you used, the journey was always the same. You descended, the air grew cold, light faded, and eventually you reached the rivers. The rivers of the underworld were not like the rivers of the living world. They were primordial forces, ancient beyond measure, each one representing a different aspect of death and the journey beyond life. First was the Acheron, the river of woe. It was the boundary river, the one that marked the edge of Hades proper. Its waters were said to be dark and cold, flowing with a current that pulled relentlessly toward the underworld. Some sources described it as a river, others as a vast lake, the Acherusian Lake, into which the other rivers flowed. But all agreed on its purpose. The Acheron was the entry point, the place where the newly dead would first encounter the reality of their situation. Waiting at the banks of the Acheron was Charon, the ferryman. He was ancient, even by divine standards, stooped and grim, with eyes that had seen every soul that ever died. He would ferry the dead across the Acheron in his boat, but only if they could pay. The traditional fee was an obol, a small bronze coin. That's why the Greeks would place coins on the eyes or under the tongues of their dead during funeral rites. Without payment, a soul would be forced to wander the shores of the Acheron for 100 years before being permitted to cross. Once across the Acheron, the dead would encounter the Styx. This was perhaps the most famous of all the underworld rivers, the river of hatred, the river upon which the gods themselves swore their most binding oaths. To swear by the Styx was to make a promise that could not be broken. Even Zeus would not violate an oath made on the Styx. The river's waters were said to be deadly, capable of destroying anything they touched. When the hero Achilles was a baby, his mother Thetis dipped him in the Styx to make him invulnerable. It worked for his entire body, except for the heel by which she held him, which remained unprotected and would eventually prove his doom. The Styx was not just a river, but also a goddess, an Oceanid, the daughter of Oceanus and Tethys. During the Titanomachy, she had been the first to ally with Zeus, bringing her children Nike, victory, Kratos, strength, Bia, force, and Zealous, zeal, to fight alongside the Olympians. As a reward, Zeus gave her name eternal significance. Any god who lied while swearing upon the Styx would lose their voice for 9 years, a punishment that for an immortal being who lived forever must have felt like an eternity. In some versions, the Styx circled the underworld 7 times, creating a serpentine barrier between the living and the dead. In others, it flowed directly from the Acheron. But regardless of its exact course, the Styx was a boundary that no soul could cross without authorization from Hades himself. Next was the Phlegethon, the river of fire. It flowed with flames instead of water, or perhaps it was water so hot it appeared to be fire. The Phlegethon ran parallel to the Cocytus and eventually merged with the Acheron in a cascade that must have been one of the most terrifying sights in all the underworld. The river was used to punish certain souls, those who had committed particularly heinous crimes. They would be immersed in its burning currents, suffering forever, but never being consumed, never being granted the mercy of complete destruction. The Cocytus was the river of lamentation, the river of wailing. Its name came from the Greek word for lament, and it was fed by the tears of those who died in misery. The river flowed through the darkest regions of Hades, and the sounds of grief echoed along its banks. It was cold where the Phlegethon was hot, a river of frozen sorrow that eventually joined with the Acheron. And finally, there was the Lethe, the river of forgetfulness. Its waters had a unique property. Anyone who drank from the Lethe would forget everything about their previous life. Memories would dissolve like mist in sunlight. Names, faces, loves, hatreds, everything that made a soul individual would wash away, leaving only a blank slate. The Lethe served different purposes depending on which Greek philosopher or poet you asked. Some said souls drank from it before being reincarnated so they wouldn't remember their past lives. Others claimed it was a mercy, a way for the dead to forget the pain of living, to achieve a kind of peace in the grey eternity of the asphodel meadows. The Orphic mysteries taught that initiates should avoid the Lethe at all costs and instead seek the waters of Mnemosyne, the pool of memory, so they could retain their identity and achieve a higher state of existence in the afterlife. These rivers crisscrossed through Hades, creating a complex geography that separated different regions of the underworld. And those regions themselves were varied, ranging from paradise to torment. The asphodel meadows were where most souls ended up. It was not a place of punishment or reward, but rather a realm of eternal neutrality. The souls there were shades, translucent and insubstantial, going through the motions of their former lives without passion or purpose. They wandered through fields of pale asphodel flowers, neither happy nor sad, neither suffering nor celebrating. It was existence without meaning, life without vitality. Some accounts described it as peaceful, a release from the struggles of mortal life. Others found it deeply tragic, a kind of living death where nothing changed and nothing mattered. For the virtuous, for heroes, and the blessed few who had pleased the gods, there was Elysium, also called the Elysian Fields, or the Isles of the Blessed. This was paradise, a place of eternal springtime where the sun somehow still shone despite being underground. The grass was always green, the air was always warm, and souls there could feast, compete in athletic games, create music, and enjoy all the pleasures of life without any of its pains. Some accounts placed Elysium at the edge of the world rather than in the underworld proper, suggesting it was somehow separate from Hades's direct domain, but most traditions included it as part of his realm. And then there was Tartarus. Tartarus was not just the worst part of the underworld, it was a cosmic prison, a place of punishment so terrible that the very ground of Hades feared it. Some sources described it as being as far below Hades as the earth was below the sky, a mathematical doubling of distance that suggested its absolute separation from anything resembling mercy or hope. Tartarus was where the truly wicked went, but it was also where the Titans had been imprisoned after their defeat. Massive bronze gates guarded its entrance, and the Hecatoncheires, the 100-handed ones who had helped Zeus win the war, now served as its jailers. Inside, the most famous villains of Greek myth suffered eternal punishments specifically designed to match their crimes. Sisyphus, who had cheated death itself, was forced to push a boulder up a hill for eternity. Every time he neared the summit, the boulder would roll back down, and he would have to begin again. It was futility incarnate, effort without result, hope perpetually denied. Tantalus, who had killed his own son and served the boy's flesh to the gods as a test of their omniscience, stood forever in a pool of water beneath a fruit tree. When he bent to drink, the water would recede. When he reached for fruit, the branches would lift just out of reach. He suffered eternal hunger and thirst, surrounded by sustenance he could never consume. Ixion, who had tried to seduce Hera, was bound to a flaming wheel that spun forever through the air, never stopping, never slowing, burning, but never consumed. The daughters of Danaus, who had murdered their husbands on their wedding night, were forced to fill a bathtub with water using leaky jars that could never hold their contents. It was endless labor, with no hope of completion. And Tityos, a giant who had tried to rape Leto, lay spread-eagled on the ground, while 2 vultures eternally devoured his liver. Each day it would regenerate, and each day the vultures would return to feast again. Tartarus was not administered by Hades himself. In most accounts, he didn't enjoy torture, didn't design these punishments. That was the domain of the Furies, the Erinyes, ancient spirits of vengeance who predated even the Titans. They were the enforcers of natural law, the ones who ensured that crimes against family, against the sacred bonds of kinship and oath, would be punished without mercy or reprieve. There were 3 judges who decided where souls would go: Minos, Rhadamanthys, and Aeacus. They were legendary kings in life, known for their wisdom and justice. In death, they became the arbiters of the underworld, weighing the deeds of each soul, determining whether it deserved Elysium, the Asphodel Meadows, or the depths of Tartarus. Hades himself presided over this realm from his palace, a structure of dark stone and precious metals, decorated with the wealth that came from beneath the earth. He sat upon an ebony throne, holding a scepter and sometimes a 2-pronged staff called a bident. His expression in art was always solemn, never cruel, but never kind either, simply implacable. He was dressed in dark robes, often with a key at his belt, symbolizing that the gates of the underworld were locked and he alone could open them. At the entrance to his palace sat Cerberus, the Hound of Hades. If Hades was feared, Cerberus was terrifying. The Hound of the Underworld was no ordinary dog. He was a monster, one of the many offspring of Typhon and Echidna, the same monstrous couple who produced the Hydra, the Chimera, and the Sphinx. Ancient sources disagreed on exactly how many heads Cerberus had. Homer simply called him the dog, without further description. Hesiod, always one for dramatic excess, claimed Cerberus had 50 heads and a voice of bronze. Pindar went even further, suggesting 100 heads. But practical considerations won out in art and later literature. 3 heads became the standard depiction, 3 snarling canine faces that could watch in all directions at once, ensuring nothing escaped notice. But the heads were only the beginning of Cerberus's monstrous appearance. From his body sprouted serpents, either forming a mane around his necks or writhing along his spine like living tentacles. His tail was not a normal dog's tail, but a serpent itself, with a venomous head that could strike with deadly precision. Some accounts gave him lion's claws and described his 3 mouths as dripping with poison foam. Cerberus's role was simple but crucial. He guarded the gates of Hades. His job was twofold. First, he prevented the living from entering the underworld. Anyone who tried to sneak past him would be torn apart and devoured. Second, and perhaps more importantly, he prevented the dead from leaving. Once a soul entered Hades, it was supposed to stay there. Cerberus ensured this rule was absolute. But for all his terrifying appearance and fierce duty, Cerberus was, at heart, a dog. He was loyal to Hades with the unwavering devotion that dogs show their masters. When Hades walked past, Cerberus's 3 tails would wag. When Hades sat on his throne, Cerberus would lie at his feet, a monstrous but faithful companion in the eternal darkness. This loyalty, this dog-like nature, was Cerberus's weakness. 3 times in all the myths, Cerberus was defeated or bypassed, and each time it involved exploiting his basic canine instincts. The first was when Orpheus descended to the underworld. Orpheus, the legendary musician, had lost his wife Eurydice to a snake bite on their wedding day. Mad with grief, he decided to journey to Hades and beg the god to return her to life. When he reached the gates of the underworld, Cerberus stood in his way, 3 heads snarling, ready to tear this living intruder apart. But Orpheus didn't fight. He didn't try to sneak past. Instead, he played his lyre. The music that flowed from Orpheus's fingers was unlike anything Cerberus had ever heard. It was beautiful, yes, but more than that, it was full of emotion, full of longing and love and profound sadness. It told the story of Orpheus's loss, of the empty space where Eurydice had been, of the silence that had replaced her laughter. The music spoke of death and the unbearable weight of continuing to live when the one you love is gone. Cerberus, for all his monstrous appearance, understood. His 3 heads lowered, his serpent mane stilled. He lay down and let Orpheus pass, charmed not just by the skill of the music, but by the raw honesty of its emotion. Even a monster could be moved by genuine grief. The second time Cerberus was defeated was by Heracles, the greatest hero of Greek mythology. As the last of his 12 labors, Heracles was commanded by King Eurystheus to bring Cerberus up from the underworld and present him at the king's palace. It was supposed to be an impossible task, a death sentence disguised as a challenge. Heracles approached the task differently than Orpheus had. He traveled to Eleusis first and was initiated into the Eleusinian mysteries, secret rites that taught participants about death and the afterlife. Then he descended to the Underworld, not as an intruder, but as someone who understood and respected its nature. When he reached Hades's palace, Heracles did something remarkable. He asked permission. He explained his task to Hades and Persephone and requested that he be allowed to take Cerberus to the surface world temporarily. Hades, impressed by Heracles' respect, agreed to the request, but only on one condition. Heracles had to overpower Cerberus using no weapons, just his bare hands. Heracles found Cerberus at the gates of the Acheron. He wore his Nemean lion skin as armor, thick enough to protect him from the monster's teeth and claws. Then he charged. What followed was one of the most epic wrestling matches in all mythology. Heracles wrapped his arms around Cerberus's 3 necks in a brutal chokehold. Cerberus bit and thrashed, his serpent tail striking again and again, pumping venom into Heracles' flesh. But Heracles was the son of Zeus, half-god himself, strong enough to hold the sky on his shoulders. He held on, squeezed, and slowly, gradually, Cerberus weakened. Finally, the great hound passed out from lack of air. Heracles bound him with adamantine chains that even a monster couldn't break and dragged him to the surface. The sunlight had never touched Cerberus before. When the dog saw daylight for the first time, he panicked, struggling wildly, his 3 heads howling in terror. But Heracles held firm and brought him to Eurystheus' palace. The king took one look at the 3-headed hound of hell and dove into a storage jar, hiding like a frightened child. Heracles had completed his labor. He released Cerberus back to Hades, where the dog returned to his post, traumatized but alive, forever after, remembered as the only monster Heracles had been required to capture, rather than kill. The 3rd defeat of Cerberus came through simple bribery. When the Sibyl of Cumae needed to guide the hero Aeneas through the underworld, she brought along drugged honey cakes. She tossed one to Cerberus, and the dog, unable to resist the smell, gobbled it up immediately. The drugs took effect, and Cerberus slumped into a deep sleep, allowing Aeneas to pass safely. Later, when Psyche needed to descend to the underworld to fetch a box of beauty from Persephone for the goddess Aphrodite, she used the same trick. 2 barley cakes, one for the way in and one for the way out. And Cerberus was too busy eating to notice her passing. These stories reveal something important about both Cerberus and Hades. Despite ruling the realm of the dead, despite commanding monsters and enforcing the finality of death, there was a reasonableness to it all. Cerberus could be calmed with music, defeated with strength, or distracted with treats, just like any dog. Hades could be convinced to bend the rules if someone showed proper respect and had a good reason. The underworld was not arbitrary cruelty. It was order, and order, even dark order, even the order of death itself, could be negotiated with, reasoned with, sometimes even overcome. For all his power, for all the souls under his command, Hades was alone. His palace was magnificent, built of precious stones and metals drawn from deep within the earth. But it was empty. His throne was imposing, carved from dark stone and decorated with gold, but no one sat beside him. He ruled the dead, yes, but ruling is a cold comfort when you have no one to share your existence with. Zeus visited Olympus rarely, and when he did, he came with his thundering presence and his endless affairs, constantly distracted by his latest seduction or power play. Poseidon never visited at all, too busy with his volatile ocean realm, stirring up storms and fathering children with sea nymphs. The rest of the Olympians avoided Hades' realm entirely. Hermes came regularly in his role as psychopomp, guide of souls, but he never stayed long. He delivered the dead and left as quickly as possible, clearly uncomfortable in the perpetual gloom. So Hades was alone, and perhaps that's why, when he saw Persephone, something in him broke open. Her name means she who destroys the light, though in some earlier traditions she was simply called Kor, the maiden. She was the daughter of Demeter, goddess of the harvest, and Zeus, making her Hades' niece. She was young, beautiful, innocent, everything that the underworld was not. She spent her days in sunlit meadows, gathering flowers with the nymphs, laughing in ways that Hades had forgotten existed. Accounts differ on how Hades first saw her. Some say he rarely left his realm, but that one day he ventured to the surface, driving his chariot pulled by coal-black horses, and spotted her by chance. Others suggest he had been watching her for some time, observing from cracks in the earth, falling slowly and helplessly, in love with someone he knew he could never have. Because who would choose to live in the underworld? What young goddess in her right mind would abandon sunlight and flowers to dwell in eternal darkness among the dead? Hades knew this. He knew that if he asked, she would refuse. And so, he did what many gods did when they wanted something they couldn't have honestly. He decided to take it. But Hades was careful. He was strategic. He went to Zeus first. This is an often overlooked detail in the myth, but it's crucial. Hades didn't just abduct Persephone on a whim. He sought permission from her father Zeus, following the traditional customs of Greek marriage, where the father gave his daughter to a husband without necessarily consulting the bride herself. Zeus, thinking perhaps that Hades deserved some happiness, or perhaps simply not wanting to refuse his eldest brother, agreed. He gave Persephone to Hades, but he didn't tell Demeter. Zeus helped arrange the abduction. He created a trap, a beautiful narcissus flower that grew in a meadow where Persephone often played. The flower was unlike any she had ever seen, with 100 blooms on a single stem, radiating light and perfume that drew her irresistibly forward. Persephone wandered away from her companions, reaching for the miraculous flower. As her fingers touched its petals, the earth split open with a sound like thunder. From the chasm emerged Hades in his black chariot, drawn by his immortal horses. Before Persephone could scream, before she could run, he swept her up and plunged back into the earth. The ground closed behind them, leaving no trace except the scattered petals of the narcissus and the echo of a cry that faded into silence. Demeter heard that cry. Mothers always do. She ran to the meadow, but found nothing. No daughter, no sign of struggle. Just the other nymphs standing confused and frightened, unable to say what had happened, because they hadn't seen. They had been distracted by Zeus's machinations, and Persephone had vanished as if she had never existed. What followed was a mother's grief on a cosmic scale. Demeter stopped doing her work. As goddess of the harvest, her job was to ensure that crops grew, that the seasons turned, that the earth provided food for mortals. But without Persephone, Demeter couldn't function. She wandered the world, searching every land, every shore, calling her daughter's name. She disguised herself as an old woman. She stopped caring for her appearance, for rituals, for anything except finding Persephone. And as Demeter neglected her duties, the world began to die. Crops failed, plants withered, the earth, so recently green and fertile, turned brown and barren. Farmers stared in despair at fields that produced nothing. Animals starved. People began to starve. Entire cities faced famine, and no amount of prayer or sacrifice could make the crops grow, because the goddess who controlled them was not listening, was not caring, was lost in her own anguish. For 9 days and nights, Demeter searched. She asked everyone she met if they had seen her daughter, but no one could help. The sun god Helios, who sees everything from his chariot high above, finally took pity on her and revealed the truth. Hades had taken Persephone, and Zeus had allowed it. Demeter's grief turned to fury. She refused to return to Olympus. She refused to make things grow. She would let the world starve, let humanity perish until her daughter was returned. It was blackmail on a divine scale, and Zeus, watching from Olympus as prayers and sacrifices diminished because there were no offerings left to give, realized he had made a terrible mistake. He sent Hermes to the underworld with a command: return Persephone to her mother. Meanwhile, in the underworld, Persephone was going through her own transformation. At first, she had been terrified. She had been ripped from the sunlight, from her mother, from everything she knew, and dragged into a realm of shadows and whispers. She was trapped in a palace that, while magnificent, felt like a prison. The dead surrounded her, translucent souls going about their eternal business. And Hades, this grim god who had stolen her, sat on his throne and watched her with eyes that held depths she couldn't begin to understand. But Hades, for all his darkness, was not cruel to her. He didn't force himself on her, despite what later adaptations would suggest. He gave her space, gave her time. He tried, in his awkward way, to make her comfortable. He showed her the gardens of the underworld where strange flowers grew that needed no sun. He gave her authority, named her queen of the underworld, gave her real power over the dead. And slowly, against her will, Persephone began to see another side of existence. She saw the dead, not as frightening things, but as souls who had been released from the pain of living. She saw the order of the underworld, the way Hades maintained balance, ensuring that death remained permanent so that life could have meaning. She saw his loneliness, his quiet dignity, his absolute dedication to a thankless job that no other god wanted. She began to understand him, and understanding, in myths as in life, is often the first step toward something deeper. When Hermes arrived with Zeus's command, Hades knew he had lost. He couldn't defy Zeus directly, couldn't keep Persephone against the will of the king of the gods. But he also couldn't bear to lose her, not entirely, not forever. So he did something clever. Some versions say he tricked her. Others suggest she knew exactly what she was doing. But the result was the same. Before Persephone left, she ate pomegranate seeds. In some tellings, it was 3 seeds. In others, 4 or 6. The number varied, but the principle remained constant. Anyone who consumed food or drink in the underworld was bound to it. It was an ancient law, older than the gods themselves. The dead could not leave because they had consumed the food of death. And now Persephone, by eating those few seeds, had become bound to Hades' realm. When she returned to the surface, when she embraced her mother, and felt sunlight on her face for the first time in months. The joy was real. Demeter wept with relief, and immediately the earth responded. Flowers bloomed, grass grew. The world, which had been dying, sprang back to life in an explosion of green. But the celebration didn't last. Zeus, in his role as mediator, revealed the problem. Persephone had eaten in the underworld. She could not remain in the world of the living forever. A compromise would have to be reached. The exact terms varied depending on who was telling the story. In some versions, Persephone would spend 4 months in the underworld and 8 with her mother. In others, it was 6 months in each realm, divided equally. But the result was the same. Persephone would be split between 2 worlds, 2 lives, 2 aspects of herself. This myth became the Greek explanation for the seasons. When Persephone descended to the underworld, Demeter grieved, and autumn and winter came to the world. The earth grew cold and barren, plants died, and life retreated underground to wait. But when Persephone returned each spring, Demeter rejoiced, and the world erupted in new growth, new life, new hope. But the myth was about more than seasons. It was about loss, about transformation, about the way people change when they experience the dark places of existence. Persephone descended as Kor, the innocent maiden. She returned as something else, something more complex. She had seen death. She had ruled the dead. She had learned to love the god of the underworld, or at least to understand him. She was no longer just the daughter of Demeter. She was the queen of the underworld, feared and respected by the dead, holder of power that even Zeus treated carefully. And Hades, for his part, was no longer alone. For part of each year, he had someone beside him, someone who understood both worlds, who could speak of sunlight and flowers, but also appreciated the strange beauty of his dark realm. The abduction that had begun with violence and grief ended with something approaching partnership. It wasn't a perfect relationship. Myths rarely are. But it was real, complex, and utterly fascinating. Hades and Persephone became one of the most compelling couples in Greek mythology, not because their story was romantic in the modern sense, but because it was complicated, because it dealt with consent and compromise, with duty and unexpected love, with the way people can find meaning and even happiness in places they never expected. Hades as ruler, his character and domain. To understand Hades the god, you must first understand that he was defined by what he was not. He was not Zeus, was not interested in ruling all of creation, didn't desire worship or glory. He was not Poseidon, wasn't volatile or temperamental, didn't rage against perceived slights. He was not Ares, the god of war, didn't revel in bloodshed or chaos. He was not Apollo, had no interest in beauty or music or prophecy. Hades was, above all else, steady. He was the rock at the foundation of the cosmos, the god who maintained the one absolute truth. Death is final. In a pantheon full of tricksters and shapeshifters, of gods who broke their own rules whenever convenient, Hades was the embodiment of law. Not justice exactly. The judges of the dead handled that, but law in its purest form, the inescapable reality that some things cannot be negotiated, cannot be avoided, cannot be charmed away with clever words. He was called Hades the inevitable, Hades the unbending. The Greeks said he was pitiless, not because he was cruel, but because pity would undermine his entire function. If he let every grieving lover reclaim their dead, if he allowed exceptions for every hero who thought themselves special, death would lose its meaning, life would lose its urgency, the natural order would collapse. And so Hades said no. He said it constantly, to mortals begging for more time, to heroes demanding exceptions, to gods requesting favors. He said no, and he meant it, and he enforced it absolutely. But that didn't make him a villain. If anything, it made him tragically necessary. Hades rarely left his realm. There are only a handful of myths where he appears outside the underworld, and most of them are brief. One story, mentioned only in passing by Homer, describes Hades traveling to Pylos to fight alongside the mortals there against Heracles. It went poorly for Hades, who took an arrow to the shoulder and had to flee back to his realm to heal. The wound troubled him greatly, not because it hurt, though it did, but because it represented a rare moment when he had stepped outside his role and been punished for it. Another time, Hades supposedly abducted a nymph named Mintha. She was a daughter of the river Cocytus, and according to some versions, Hades was attracted to her. Persephone, discovering this, flew into a rage and transformed Minthe into the mint plant. It was one of the few times Persephone displayed the kind of divine jealousy that characterized so many other divine relationships. There was also Luce, another nymph, who lived as Hades' consort before Persephone. When she died, Hades transformed her into a white poplar tree in the Elysian fields, allowing her to live forever in the paradise region of his realm. It was an act of kindness from a god not known for tenderness. But these stories are rare. Mostly Hades stayed in his palace, seated on his ebony throne, with Cerberus at his feet and Persephone, when she was there, at his side. He maintained order. He ensured the dead remained dead. He kept the balance. His symbols were telling. He carried a bident, a two-pronged staff that looked like Poseidon's trident, but with one prong fewer. Where Poseidon's weapon could create earthquakes and storms, Hades' bident was more subtle, used for guiding and controlling rather than destroying. He held a key, symbolizing that the gates of his realm were locked. He was sometimes depicted with a cornucopia, a horn of plenty, representing the wealth that came from beneath the earth, all the metals and gems and fertile soil that humanity depended on. That wealth gave him another name, Pluton, or Pluto in Latin. The name meant wealthy, and it became the most common way to refer to Hades, a euphemism that allowed people to speak of him without using his true name. As Pluton, Hades was not just the god of death, but the god of hidden riches, of everything valuable that lay beneath the surface. He was the giver of wealth, the one who blessed humanity with the resources they needed to survive. This dual nature, death and wealth, darkness and riches, made Hades one of the most complex figures in Greek mythology. He was feared, but also respected, avoided, but also necessary. People didn't want to think about him, but they acknowledged his importance. No major city built temples to Hades. There were no festivals in his honor, no public celebrations of death. But every household kept a small shrine. Every farmer acknowledged that the bounty came from earth, his domain. In later philosophical traditions, particularly in Orphism and certain Platonic schools, Hades took on even deeper significance. He became a kind of metaphysical principle, the force that maintained boundaries between existence and non-existence, between form and dissolution. Philosophers debated whether Hades was a person, or a place, or perhaps both simultaneously, a god so identified with his realm that the two were inseparable. Some ancient writers tried to rationalize Hades, to strip away the supernatural elements and explain him as a historical figure who had been deified. They claimed Cerberus was really just a large snake, that the rivers of the underworld were actual geographical features, that Hades had been a powerful chieftain who controlled access to caves rich in minerals. But these explanations miss the point. Hades was never meant to be rational. He was meant to be the answer to humanity's greatest fear and greatest mystery. What happens when we die? The underworld was meant to be a one-way journey. You died. Hermes guided your soul to the banks of the Acheron. You paid Charon. You crossed the river, and you never came back. That was the rule, absolute and unchanging. And yet, remarkably, several heroes managed to break that rule. They descended to Hades while still alive, completed their quests, and returned to tell the tale. Each one had to negotiate with Hades in some way, and each encounter reveals something different about the Lord of the Underworld. We've already discussed two of these descents. Orpheus charmed his way past Cerberus with music and convinced Hades to release Eurydice through the power of his grief-stricken song. Heracles wrestled Cerberus bare-handed as the last of his 12 labors with Hades' permission and successfully brought the hound to the surface before returning him unharmed. But there were others. Odysseus, the legendary hero of the Trojan War, descended to the underworld not to retrieve someone or steal something, but to seek knowledge. During his 10-year journey home to Ithaca, the witch Circe advised him that he needed to consult the spirit of the prophet Tiresias to learn how to reach his homeland safely. Tiresias, even in death, retained his prophetic abilities, and only he could guide Odysseus through the dangers ahead. So Odysseus sailed to the edge of the world, to a place where the living world touched the realm of the dead. He dug a pit and poured libations of milk, honey, wine, and water. Then he sacrificed a ram and a ewe, letting their blood flow into the pit. The blood drew the shades of the dead like moths to flame. They clustered around, desperate for a taste of the life force that had been denied them. Odysseus held them back with his sword, allowing only Tiresias to drink first. The prophet drank and regained enough strength to speak. He warned Odysseus of the trials ahead, told him to avoid harming the cattle of the sun, god Helios, predicted that Odysseus would return home alone and find his house full of suitors courting his wife. But the encounter didn't end there. After speaking with Tiresias, Odysseus allowed other shades to drink and regain their voices. He spoke with his mother, Anticlea, who had died while he was at war, never knowing if her son survived. Their conversation is one of the most heartbreaking moments in all of Greek literature. Odysseus tried 3 times to embrace his mother's shade, and 3 times his arms passed through her like smoke. She was there but not there, present but unreachable, the ultimate symbol of what death takes from us. He also spoke with great heroes of the past. Achilles, the mightiest warrior of the Trojan War, told Odysseus something shocking. "I would rather be a living slave to a landless man than king of all the dead." Glory meant nothing in the underworld. Fame faded in the grey eternity of asphodel. What mattered was life itself, breathing and struggling and feeling, even in poverty and suffering. Hades himself didn't appear to Odysseus, but his presence was felt throughout the encounter. The underworld accepted Odysseus temporarily, allowed him to gain the knowledge he needed, but it also showed him the ultimate futility of heroic glory. All those great warriors, all those celebrated kings, reduced to translucent shades begging for a sip of blood so they could remember what it felt like to be alive. Then there was the story of Theseus and Pirithous, which ended rather badly. Theseus, the great hero of Athens who had slain the Minotaur, had a best friend named Pirithous, king of the Lapiths. The two men had sworn an oath of friendship and decided, in what can only be described as spectacular hubris, that they would each marry a daughter of Zeus. Theseus chose Helen of Sparta, who was still a child at the time. They abducted her successfully, though Theseus's mother cared for the girl rather than forcing her into marriage. Helen's brothers eventually rescued her, but that's another story. Pirithous made a worse choice. He decided he wanted to marry Persephone, queen of the underworld, consort of Hades. Never mind that she was already married. Never mind that she was a goddess and he was a mortal. Never mind that attempting to kidnap the wife of the god of the dead seemed like a particularly terrible idea. Pirithous was determined, and Theseus, bound by their oath of friendship, agreed to help him. The two heroes descended to the underworld openly, walking through one of the gates as if they had every right to be there. When they reached Hades's palace, Hades greeted them with surprising hospitality. He invited them to sit and rest from their journey. They accepted, sitting down on stone chairs, and that's when they discovered they couldn't stand up. The chairs were called the chairs of forgetfulness, or in some versions, the chairs of Lethe. The moment someone sat in them, the chairs bound that person in place, physically and mentally. Theseus and Pirithous found themselves trapped, unable to move, their memories beginning to fade as Lethe's influence crept over them. They sat there for years, perhaps decades, forgotten by the world above, their grand plan to kidnap Persephone revealed for the foolishness it was. Hades didn't torture them. He didn't need to. The chairs themselves were punishment enough, a reminder that some boundaries should not be crossed, some gods should not be challenged, and the underworld shows no special favor to heroes. Eventually, Heracles came to the underworld for his labor involving Cerberus. He saw Theseus and Pirithous still sitting there, barely conscious. Heracles, moved by pity, broke the spell that held Theseus. The earth shook when he pulled Theseus from the chair, the entire underworld reacting to this violation of its punishment. But Theseus came free and returned to the world of the living, traumatized but alive. Heracles tried to free Pirithous too, but when he touched the chair, the earth shook even more violently. Rocks fell from the ceiling. The ground cracked. It was a warning from Hades himself. Pirithous had committed the graver sin. He had intended to violate Persephone, to kidnap the queen of the underworld. For that, there would be no mercy, no rescue, no reprieve. Heracles, understanding the message, left Pirithous there. As far as we know, he's still sitting in that chair, lost in the fog of forgetfulness, serving an eternal sentence for his hubris. Aeneas, the Trojan hero, who would eventually found the line that led to Rome, also descended to the underworld. His journey, described in detail by the Roman poet Virgil in the Aeneid, was one of the most elaborate underworld narratives in all of classical literature. Aeneas descended with the guidance of the Sibyl of Cumae, a priestess of Apollo who knew the secret paths to the realm of the dead. They brought golden boughs as an offering to Persephone and drugged cakes to distract Cerberus. When they crossed the Styx, Charon initially refused to ferry them, saying he'd been burned before by living heroes who caused trouble in his realm. But the Sibyl showed him the golden bough, and Charon reluctantly agreed to take them across. In Hades, Aeneas saw many things. He saw the souls of infants who died too young, the victims of false accusation, those who killed themselves for love. He saw Dido, the queen of Carthage, who had loved him and killed herself when he left her. He tried to speak to her, to apologize, but her shade turned away, cold and unforgiving, even in death. Eventually, Aeneas reached the Elysian fields, where he met the shade of his father, Anchises. His father showed him a vision of the future, all the great Romans who would be born, all the glory that Rome would achieve. It was prophecy and family reunion combined, a moment of hope in the midst of death. Aeneas returned to the living world through the gates of ivory, one of two gates from the Underworld. The gates of horn, it was said, allowed true visions and prophecies to pass. The gates of ivory were for lies and false dreams. The fact that Aeneas left through the ivory gates has troubled scholars for centuries. Was Virgil suggesting that his vision of Rome's future was false? Or was it simply the only way a living man could leave the underworld without alerting Hades to what had been revealed? Each of these descents had a different outcome, but they all shared certain elements. First, the heroes couldn't just wander in. They needed guidance, preparation, offerings. The underworld had rules, and breaking them had consequences. Second, Hades himself rarely interfered directly. He set the parameters, maintained the system, and let the nature of his realm do the work. Third, no one left unchanged. Orpheus lost Eurydice forever. Odysseus learned that glory was meaningless in death. Theseus was traumatized. Aeneas was burdened with prophecy and grief. The underworld took something from everyone who entered it, even those who managed to return. The few other myths of Hades. For such an important god, Hades appeared in remarkably few myths. He wasn't a protagonist. He wasn't a trickster causing mischief. He wasn't a seducer, leaving demigods scattered across Greece. He was simply there, maintaining order, doing his job, largely content to be left alone in his dark realm. But there are a few other stories worth mentioning. There was the myth of Sisyphus, the king of Corinth, who was famous for his cunning and complete lack of scruples. Sisyphus once betrayed Zeus by revealing one of his affairs to a river god. Zeus, furious, sent Thanatos, the personification of death itself, to chain Sisyphus and bring him to the underworld. But Sisyphus, ever clever, asked Thanatos to demonstrate how the chains worked. Thanatos, apparently not the sharpest spirit in the underworld, showed him. Sisyphus immediately tackled Thanatos and locked him in the chains instead. With death himself imprisoned, no one could die. Battles were fought where mortals sustained lethal wounds but kept fighting. The elderly lingered in suffering with no release. The natural order collapsed. The gods quickly realized something was wrong, and Ares, god of war, was particularly upset because war without death is just pointless exercise. Ares freed Thanatos, who immediately grabbed Sisyphus and dragged him to the underworld. But Sisyphus had prepared for this. He had instructed his wife not to perform the proper burial rites. When Sisyphus arrived in Hades, he complained to Persephone that his wife had failed in her duty, that he had been buried without honor, that as a king, he deserved better. Could he please be allowed to return to the surface to sort things out? He promised he'd come right back. Persephone, moved by his apparent concern for proper ritual, agreed. Sisyphus returned to life and, surprise, surprise, had no intention of going back. He lived for many more years, becoming quite old before Hermes finally caught up with him and dragged his soul back to the underworld personally. Hades, furious at being tricked, designed a special punishment. Sisyphus would push a boulder up a hill for eternity. Every time he neared the summit, the boulder would roll back down and he'd have to start over. It was the perfect punishment for someone who thought himself so clever. Endless effort with no result, hope perpetually denied, intelligence rendered completely useless. Then there was Asclepius, the legendary physician and son of Apollo, who became so skilled at healing that he began to bring the dead back to life. This was a serious problem. Hades' entire function depended on death being permanent. If doctors could just resurrect people whenever they wanted, the boundary between life and death would dissolve, the underworld would empty out, and the natural order would collapse. Hades went to Zeus and complained. Zeus, recognizing the problem, struck Asclepius down with a thunderbolt. Apollo, grieving for his son, retaliated by killing the Cyclopes who had forged Zeus's thunderbolts. It became a whole complicated mess that nearly started another war among the gods. Eventually, Zeus relented and placed Asclepius among the stars as the constellation we now know as Ophiuchus, the serpent-bearer. But the message was clear. Some boundaries exist for a reason, and even the power to heal has limits. There's also the curious case of the giant Alcyoneus, one of the Gigantes, who fought against the Olympians in the Gigantomachy. Alcyoneus had a unique property. He was immortal as long as he remained in his homeland. Heracles fought him and seemed to kill him, but every time Alcyoneus touched his native soil, he revived. Finally, Heracles dragged the giant beyond the boundaries of his homeland, and only then could Alcyoneus truly die. Some versions of this myth say that Heracles dragged Alcyoneus all the way to the gates of Hades before finishing him off, as if proximity to the underworld would ensure the giant couldn't escape death. Whether Hades was involved or even noticed is unclear, but it's another example of how the Lord of the Underworld was less a character who acted and more a force that defined boundaries. In another story, the nymph Minta, yes, the same one Persephone turned into mint, supposedly boasted that she was more beautiful than Persephone, and that Hades would eventually tire of his wife and return to her. This was, in retrospect, an incredibly stupid thing to say. Persephone heard about it and transformed Minthi into the mint plant, crushing her underfoot. Hades, unable to undo the transformation, made the plant fragrant so that Minthi would at least be pleasant as she was walked upon. It was a small mercy from a god not known for soft gestures. The story of Luce, the nymph who became a white poplar, is similarly brief. She lived with Hades before Persephone's arrival, and when she died, Hades honored her memory by transforming her into a tree and placing that tree in the Elysian fields. It suggests a gentler side to Hades, a capacity for genuine affection that rarely appeared in the myths. But these stories are exceptions. Mostly, Hades simply existed, a constant presence in the background of Greek mythology, the inevitable end that gave urgency to every heroic quest and meaning to every mortal life. The legacy of Hades. So what do we make of Hades, this god who never wanted worship, who accepted his dark domain without complaint, who ruled the dead with stern fairness and rarely interfered in the world of the living? In ancient Greece, Hades was respected but feared. People avoided speaking his name. They avoided building temples to him. When they sacrificed to him, they did so away from their homes, turning their faces away from the altar, averting their eyes as if looking at death too directly might invite it in. And yet, Hades was never seen as evil. That's crucial to understand. The Greeks feared death, yes, but they also accepted it as natural, as necessary. Hades was the god who made sure that natural process worked correctly. He wasn't the enemy. He was the guarantee that life had meaning precisely because it ended. Compare this to how Hades has been portrayed in more recent centuries. Christian influence with its Satan figure contaminated our understanding of Hades. We turned him into a devil, a punisher of souls, a tempter who lured people to damnation. But that's not who he was in Greek mythology. He didn't tempt. He didn't torture for fun. He simply presided over the realm all mortals would eventually enter. In modern popular culture, we've seen a slow rehabilitation of Hades' character. The 2018 video game Hades, for example, portrays him as stern but not cruel, demanding but capable of growth and change. Rick Riordan's Percy Jackson series shows Hades as bitter about being stuck with the Underworld, but ultimately fair and honorable. These modern interpretations are actually closer to the ancient sources than the medieval depictions of Hades as Satan-like ever were. Hades teaches us something important about death. He reminds us that death is not punishment. It's transition. It's transformation. It's the boundary that makes life precious. A world where no one died would quickly become meaningless. Achievements would mean nothing if you had infinite time to accomplish them. Relationships would lose urgency if you never had to face loss. Love itself would be diminished if it weren't haunted by the knowledge that one day we'll have to say goodbye. Hades understood this. He maintained the boundary not out of cruelty, but out of necessity. And in doing so, he gave humanity something paradoxical but profound, the finite nature that makes infinite meaning possible. The Greeks also understood something else through Hades. They understood that the rich and the poor, the powerful and the weak all end up in the same place. Death is the ultimate equalizer. In the underworld, a king is just another shade. A slave who lived virtuously might dwell in Elysium, while a tyrant suffers in Tartarus. Hades judged souls based on their deeds, not their social status. It was one of the few truly fair systems in Greek mythology. Today, when we say someone has gone to Hades, we usually mean something negative, implying punishment or suffering. But the ancient Greeks would have understood it differently. To go to Hades simply meant to die. It was inevitable. It was natural. And if you had lived well, if you had honored the gods and treated others fairly, you might even find a kind of peace there, dwelling in the asphodel meadows, or if you were very fortunate, in the eternal spring of Elysium. Hades never sought glory. He never competed with his brothers for status or influence. He simply did his job day after day, year after year, century after century. He accepted the burden of ruling the dead so that the living could exist without chaos, so that death could have structure and meaning. And perhaps that's the most important lesson Hades offers us. Some work is necessary even when it's thankless. Some roles must be filled even when they bring no glory. Some boundaries must be maintained even when maintaining them makes you unpopular, feared, avoided. Hades did that work. He filled that role. He maintained that boundary. And the cosmos was better for it. Conclusion: we've journeyed through the complete story of Hades, from his traumatic birth and imprisonment to his reluctant ascension to the throne of the Underworld. We've explored his realm, its rivers and regions, its inhabitants, and its purpose. We've met Cerberus, the loyal hound who guarded the gates. We've seen Persephone's abduction and transformation into queen of the underworld. We've watched heroes descend, and in some cases, return. We've examined the few other myths where Hades appeared, and we've considered what this ancient god still has to teach us. Hades stands as one of the most misunderstood figures in all mythology. He was not evil. He was not the devil. He was not a torturer or a tempter. He was simply the god of the inevitable, the keeper of the final boundary, the ruler of a realm that every mortal would eventually visit. In a pantheon full of dramatic, flamboyant, passionate gods, Hades was quiet. In a family of backstabbers and manipulators, he was steady. In a world of constant change and chaos, he maintained the one truth that never varied. Death is permanent, and that permanence gives life its meaning. He deserves better than to be remembered as a villain. He deserves better than to have his name become synonymous with hell. Hades was, in his own way, as heroic as any of the celebrated figures of Greek mythology. He accepted a burden no one else wanted. He ruled a realm everyone feared. He did his job without complaint, without glory, without thanks, and in doing so, he became essential, not just to Greek mythology, but to the human understanding of mortality itself. So the next time you hear someone invoke Hades' name as an insult or use his realm as shorthand for suffering, remember the truth. Remember the god who drew the short straw and accepted his fate with quiet dignity. Remember the ruler who maintained order in the darkest part of the cosmos. Remember the husband who learned to love in the most unlikely place, and the brother who never betrayed his family, even when he had every reason to feel betrayed by them. Remember Hades, lord of the underworld, and understand that sometimes the most important gods are the ones we fear to name. If you found this journey into the darkness enlightening, if these myths helped you see death and the afterlife in a new way, consider leaving a like on this video and subscribing for more deep dives into mythology. Let me know in the comments what other gods or myths you'd like to explore. And remember, as the ancient Greeks knew, death is not the enemy. It's simply the boundary that makes life precious. Until next time, sleep well.